So now that we've learned how to choose a solvent for recrystallization, we're going to do an entire recrystallization. In this example, I'm going to use benzoic acid, which I know has low solubility in water at room temperature and high solubility in boiling water. And so I'm just going to place a small amount of benzoic acid in this Erlenmeyer and add some water to it. The exact amount of water we add is not all that important because we're going to adjust that as needed throughout the recrystallization. If we find once the water comes to a boil that not all the benzoic acid has dissolved, we'll add additional water. But if we find that it has dissolved the benzoic acid too easily, that may mean we've added too much solvent and we need to boil some of the water off. So now we have this on our hot plate and we just need to wait for the solution to come to a boil. We can now see our water has come to a boil, but if we look at our solution we can see that it's still somewhat cloudy, meaning that not all of the benzoic acid has dissolved. So at this point we're going to add a little bit more water, and again now we need to wait for that to come to a boil. It is very possible that when you add additional solvent that more solid is going to crystallize out because the solvent you're adding is not yet heated, and so you're cooling down the temperature of the overall solution. Again, we come to a boil, it's not completely dissolved. We'll know it's completely dissolved because it'll look like water does normally as just a completely transparent solution. So again, we'll add an additional quantity of water. When you're doing this, you do not need to carefully measure out these quantities during a recrystallization. As you can see, as we come to a boil this time, our solution is starting to clear up, but we're not completely there. So we're going to continue to add small amounts of water and bringing our solution to a boil. Now after the last addition we were very, very close to everything being dissolved, so it should not take much more. And as we can see with this additional amount of water, everything is dissolved. So we're now going to remove this from the hot plate and let it cool, and we are going to zoom in on that. And as it cools, we should see the solid coming back out of solution and crystallizing. Now, one step which we skipped in this process was a hot filtration. Because when the benzoic acid was fully dissolved, our solution was completely colorless and completely clear, and there were no insoluble impurities. If we had had any completely insoluble impurities, we would have filtered the solution while it was still hot. But since there weren't any, we've skipped over that step. And as we can start to see already, and this flask is still very, very hot, we do have now a very cloudy solution, and the more this cools, the more benzoic acid that will crystallize out. So we're going to let this cool first to room temperature, and then once we've gotten to room temperature, we're going to place it in an ice bath. Okay, now that our benzoic acid and water has reached room temperature, we're ready to place it in an ice bath. You can see by looking at this flask, we've gotten significant crystallization as we have a lot of solid in this flask. So I'll now place it in an ice bath, and we'll let it remain in the ice bath for about 5 minutes. Now in this recrystallization, we can see the crystallization happened very, very quickly. If that had not been the case, we would have wanted to take a glass stirring rod and scratch the solution, scratch the stirring rod inside the solution, and that will often help us to crystallize. So as I said, we're going to let this cool in an ice bath for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to filter it. So now that our crystallized solution has been sitting in an ice bath for a sufficient time, we're ready to filter it. To filter it, we need a filter flask. This is the piece of glassware that looks like an Erlenmeyer, but also has a sidearm. We're going to clamp that into position, We need a filter adapter that goes right in the top of the filter flask, a Buchner funnel, and a piece of filter paper. Then, in order to help facilitate the filtration, we're going to connect the sidearm on the filter flask to an aspirator. The aspirator will pull a vacuum on our flask and help pull the solvent through much faster. Before we do this, though, we want to wet our filter paper. We're going to do that with the same solvent that we've used for the recrystallization. So we're going to turn the aspirator on. We want to turn these up as high as we can without the water splashing all over your bench. I'm not going to turn this up as high as we normally would, just so that you can still hear me. Once you've got it turned on, you can test whether or not you've got a vacuum by putting your hand over the funnel, and if you feel your glove being pulled down, then you've got a vacuum. I'm just going to wet the filter paper with a little bit of water and then push this down. We can see the water coming through. And so now I'm going to filter our recrystallized benzoic acid. As you can see, some of the benzoic acid is now in the funnel. The water is filtered through. But we do still have a lot of benzoic acid left in our flask, and we want to optimize and get all of that out. So there's two things that we can do. One is to use a spatula, as I'm doing now, to try and scrape out as much as we can. But we can also try to use some solvent to transfer the remaining benzoic acid over. And the best solvent we can use is the solvent that we've been using for the recrystallization, water. But we don't want to use warm water, because the warmer the water is, the more it may dissolve the benzoic acid. So we want water that's been cooled down to 0 degrees. Now, if we're using an organic solvent for a recrystallization, we should also have a small test tube or beaker of that solvent in our ice bath so it's cooled and ready to go. One of the convenient things about water is I don't need to make a separate solution or put a separate flask in here. I have ice water here, which is going to be at the right temperature, and so I'll just pour a small amount of the ice water in here, and then we'll pour that into our funnel as well. And then I'm just going to push down on the funnel to make sure we're getting as good a vacuum as possible. Again, our aspirator, we would want it to be turned up higher, as high as possible, and then we'll let this sit on the aspirator with the vacuum pulling for about 5 minutes to help draw as much solvent away from our product as we can. Once we're done, we want to break the vacuum by disconnecting the tubing, turning off the aspirator, and now if we look inside our funnel, we can see we have our recrystallized benzoic acid. And once we've let this dry for now an extended period of time, we can go and take a melting point and confirm its purity.